It's August 5th, 2026, and beneath the waves off the Oregon coast, something is stirring that has scientists watching their monitors a little more closely than usual. Just weeks ago, the ocean floor rattled with a swarm of quakes, strong enough to make headlines up and down the coast. And now a new study is telling us that two of the deadliest fault systems in North America might be talking to each other in ways nobody expected. We're talking about the Cascadia Subduction Zone, the fault that could unleash a magnitude 9 earthquake and a tsunami taller than a 10-story building. And new research says it might not be working alone. Millions of people from Northern California to British Columbia are sitting on top of a geological time bomb. And this week, that bomb just got a little more complicated. So grab a coffee, settle in, because we're about to break down exactly what's happening under the West Coast, why scientists are suddenly a lot more nervous, and what it would actually look like if this thing finally goes. Let's rewind a bit, because to understand why everyone's talking about this right now, you have to look at what's happened just in the last few months. Back on June 3rd, 3 earthquakes rattled the West Coast in a single day. The strongest, a magnitude 5. 7 that struck about 100 miles off the coast near Pistol River, Oregon. No tsunami warning, no real damage, but enough to get attention because of exactly where it happened, close to one of the most closely watched fault systems on the planet. Then, less than a month later, on June 29th, it happened again. A 5. 5 magnitude quake hit around 4:35 in the morning, roughly 135 miles off the coast of Bandon, followed by 2 more moderate quakes within the same hour. People woke up to notifications, checked the news, and immediately started asking the same question everybody always asks out there. Is this it? Is this the big one finally waking up? And look, I get why people jump to that. When you live with the knowledge that a 9.0 earthquake is sitting off your coastline, every rumble feels like a warning shot. But here's the thing scientists keep having to explain over and over again. These particular quakes weren't actually happening on the Cascadia Fault itself. They were happening on something called the Blanco Fracture Zone, a completely separate fault system that runs roughly parallel to the coast, out where the Juan de Fuca plate and the Pacific plate slide past each other. It's a strike-slip fault, meaning the plates are sliding sideways rather than one diving underneath the other, and that matters a lot because strike-slip motion doesn't displace huge volumes of water the way a subduction zone does, so the tsunami risk from Blanco activity is low. Seismologists will tell you the Blanco zone lights up like this once or twice a year. It's basically background noise in the world of West Coast seismology, so why are we even talking about it? Because even though Blanco isn't Cascadia, every single time it rattles, it drags Cascadia back into the conversation. And this time, the conversation landed on a discovery that's actually worth losing some sleep over. So let's actually get into the fault everybody should be watching. Because this is the platform, if you want to call it that, the one geological structure that keeps emergency planners up at night. The Cascadia Subduction Zone stretches about 600 to 700 miles, roughly 1,000 kilometers, from Northern California up through Oregon and Washington, and into Vancouver Island in British Columbia. Underneath it, the Juan de Fuca plate, a slab of oceanic crust, is diving underneath the North American plate at a rate of about 4 centimeters a year, roughly the speed your fingernails grow. Doesn't sound like much, right? But here's where it gets terrifying. Unlike most subduction zones around the world, like the ones in Japan or Chile that rumble constantly with small and medium quakes as stress releases gradually, Cascadia is eerily quiet. The plates are locked together by friction, stuck, building up stress the entire time instead of releasing it in manageable pieces. That's the geological equivalent of holding a spring under compression for centuries instead of letting it twitch every few years. And we know from the geologic record exactly what happens when that spring finally lets go. On the night of January 26, 1700, Cascadia rupture generated an earthquake believed to be somewhere around a magnitude 9. And we know the precise date because of tsunami records kept in Japan, where a mysterious orphan tsunami arrived with no preceding earthquake felt locally, and scientists were later able to match the wave arrival times back to a specific overnight rupture on the other side of the Pacific. Think about that for a second. An earthquake happened off the coast of Oregon so massive that it sent a wall of water all the way across the ocean to flood coastal villages in Japan, and nobody in Japan felt so much as a tremor before it hit. That's the scale we're talking about with a full Cascadia rupture. Now, here's the part that should really get your attention. The United States Geological Survey put out an updated report this year using advanced mathematical modeling combined with paleoseismic records, essentially digging through layers of sediment and soil to find evidence of past earthquakes stretching back thousands of years. And for the first time, this new model factored in something crucial. Exactly how much time has elapsed since that last major rupture back in 1700. The number that came out of that analysis is 15%. As in a 15% chance of a magnitude 9 earthquake striking the Cascadia Subduction Zone sometime in the next 50 years. Stretch that window out to the year 2100, and the probability climbs to 29%. Let that sink in for a moment. Nearly a 1 in 3 chance, within the lifetime of kids being born today, that this fault produces one of the most powerful earthquakes in recorded North American history. And when you look at who's sitting directly in the blast radius, this stops being an abstract science story real fast. This fault line runs directly beneath or just offshore of Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver, 3 major metropolitan areas that together are home to well over 10 million people. Add in every coastal town from Northern California to the Canadian border, fishing villages, tourist towns, entire counties that depend on Highway 101 as basically their only lifeline, and you're looking at a disaster zone that could stretch the length of an entire country's coastline. Before we go further, if you're finding this as unsettling and fascinating as I do, go ahead and hit that like button, drop a comment telling me if you live anywhere near the West Coast, and subscribe if you haven't already, because we track stories like this as they develop and you don't want to miss where this one's headed. All right, let's keep going, because the actual physical consequences of a full margin Cascadia rupture are almost hard to wrap your head around. We're talking about ground shaking that could last for several full minutes, not the 10 or 20 seconds most people associate with an earthquake, but 4, 5, maybe 6 minutes of continuous violent shaking. To put that in perspective, the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake in the Bay Area, the one that collapsed a section of the Bay Bridge and is burned into a lot of people's memories, lasted about 15 seconds. Now multiply that duration by roughly 20. Buildings that aren't built to modern seismic code, and there are a lot of them along the Pacific Northwest coast, could suffer serious structural damage or outright collapse. Bridges could fail. And then there's the tsunami. Because this is a subduction zone, one plate is being forced underneath another, the seafloor itself gets suddenly displaced vertically when the fault finally slips, shoving an enormous volume of ocean water upward all at once. Estimates on wave height vary wildly depending on which stretch of coastline you're looking at, with some models suggesting tsunami waves in the range of 30 to 100 feet in the hardest hit areas, arriving in as little as 15 to 20 minutes after the shaking starts. Coastal residents in places like Long Beach, Washington, or Seaside, Oregon would have almost no time to react, which is exactly why emergency planners in those towns have spent years building vertical evacuation structures, essentially elevated platforms people can run to when there's no time to outrun the wave itself. Now let's talk about what's actually happening underneath the surface, because this is where the science has taken a genuinely strange turn recently. Researchers from the University of Washington have spent years mapping what's going on hundreds of feet beneath the seafloor along Cascadia. And a few years back, they stumbled onto something nobody had ever documented before at a subduction zone, a site researchers nicknamed Pythia's Oasis. What they found down there wasn't your typical methane seep, the kind of slow bubbling that's fairly common on ocean floors around the world. This was something else entirely, water gushing out of the seafloor like it was coming out of a fire hose, warm, low in salinity, almost fresh compared to the surrounding seawater and rich in minerals. Lead researcher Evan Solomon described it as something he'd never personally observed before in his career studying seafloor geology. The fluid was measured at roughly 9 degrees Celsius, about 16 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than the water around it, and calculations traced its origin straight back down to the Cascadia megathrust itself, where temperatures run somewhere between 300 and 500 degrees Fahrenheit. So essentially, scientists found a direct plumbing line running from the superheated core of the fault system all the way up to the ocean floor. Why does that matter? Because fluid pressure along a fault plane plays a massive role in how much friction is holding 2 tectonic plates together. When fluid escapes and pressure drops in certain areas, it can actually change the stress dynamics along different segments of the fault, potentially explaining why the northern portion of Cascadia up near Washington behaves differently, appearing more tightly locked than the southern portion down toward Oregon. And that discovery links directly into an even newer piece of research that dropped earlier this year, published in the journal Science Advances by a team that included UW researcher Maureen Denault. Using long-term seismic noise monitoring, essentially listening to the constant faint hum of the earth itself rather than waiting around for actual earthquakes, the team identified what they're calling active protothrusts and fluid highways running through the Cascadia system. In plain English, they found that fluid isn't just sitting still down there, it's actively migrating through variable pathways within the fault zone, and that movement appears to directly influence strain patterns. One of the researchers put it simply, saying these variable fluid pathways are likely going to change how large earthquakes actually behave on this fault. That's a big deal, because for decades, the working model was relatively simple. Plates lock, stress builds uniformly. Eventually it releases in one massive slip. But if fluid is moving unpredictably through the fault system, redistributing pressure in ways we're only just now able to detect, that complicates every model we've built about how, when, and even where the next rupture might initiate, and how far it might travel. But if you thought that was the unsettling part, here's where things get genuinely wild. because of a study that came out of Oregon State University that's been making waves, pun very much intended, in the seismology community. For years, scientists have generally treated Cascadia and the San Andreas Fault down in California as two separate hazards, two different problems on two different timelines. Marine geologist Chris Goldfinger and a team of international researchers spent years drilling deep-sea sediment cores off the coast, essentially pulling up cylinders of mud and rock that represent over 3,000 years of geological history. Buried in those cores are layers called turbidites, distinct bands of sediment deposited by underwater landslides that get triggered by strong earthquakes. Basically, a time-stamped record of ancient shaking events written directly into the seafloor. When Goldfinger's team compared the turbidite records from Cascadia against records from the northern San Andreas Fault, they found something nobody had confirmed before: evidence that these two fault systems may be synchronized, meaning a major rupture on one fault appears capable of triggering a rupture on the other within minutes or hours. Goldfinger himself said it best when he put it plainly, that the scenario everyone's been fixated on, a massive standalone Cascadia earthquake, might not actually be the worst-case outcome anymore. Because if these faults really can sync up and go off together, you're not looking at one regional disaster, you're looking at a coordinated near-simultaneous catastrophe hitting San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, all within a compressed window of time. Goldfinger pointed out that a single earthquake on either fault alone would already draw down emergency resources from across the entire country to respond. If both faults ruptured together, you'd have every major West Coast metro area needing federal disaster response simultaneously, which starts raising very real, very uncomfortable questions about whether the country's emergency response infrastructure could even handle that kind of simultaneous multi-city demand. Now, is this happening tomorrow? Almost certainly not. It's important to say that clearly, because panic doesn't help anybody, and researchers like Solomon have been careful to point out that discoveries like the fluid seep don't necessarily mean an earthquake is imminent, or that the underlying hazard level has fundamentally changed overnight. What these findings actually represent is a dramatically improved understanding of a system that, for most of modern scientific history, has been almost impossible to observe directly, buried under hundreds of feet of ocean and largely silent compared to more active subduction zones elsewhere in the world. Unlike Japan's Anankai Trough or the fault systems off Chile, which produce frequent small and medium earthquakes that give scientists a constant stream of data, Cascadia mostly just sits there, locked quiet, giving up almost nothing. That silence has actually made it harder to study, not easier, which is exactly why discoveries like the fluid seep and the fault synchronization research feel like such significant breakthroughs. Scientists aren't finding new dangers so much as they're finally getting eyes on a threat that's always been there, hiding in plain sight under a few hundred feet of cold Pacific water. You made it to the global roundup section, my friend, so let's zoom out and look at what's happening with fault systems and seismic risk elsewhere around the world, because the West Coast is far from the only place dealing with this kind of buried threat. Over in Japan, the Nankai Trough remains one of the most heavily monitored subduction zones on the planet, with Japanese seismologists estimating roughly an 80% probability of a major rupture there within the next 30 years, a number that's kept entire coastal prefectures building seawalls and evacuation towers for decades. Japan's government has actually built one of the most sophisticated early warning systems in the world, specifically because of how seriously they take that threat, something American emergency planners have studied closely when designing systems like Shake Alert here on the West Coast. Meanwhile, down in Chile, which sits along one of the most seismically active subduction zones in the entire world, the country experienced yet another moderate earthquake swarm earlier this year along its central coast, a grim reminder for a country that already survived the largest earthquake ever recorded, a staggering magnitude 9.5 back in 1960. And closer to home, researchers studying Northern California have been tracking swarms of extremely small, often unfelt earthquakes beneath the region, work that's slowly revealing a far more complex web of hidden fault structures underneath the surface than previously mapped, structures that could play a role in exactly the kind of fault interaction Goldfinger's team is now documenting between Cascadia and San Andreas. Turkey, too, remains on edge following the devastating 2023 earthquakes that killed tens of thousands, with seismologists there warning that the North Anatolian Fault, similar in some ways to San Andreas, still carries significant unreleased stress beneath Istanbul, a city of over 15 million people. The pattern across all of these regions is the same: ancient faults, massive population centers built directly on top of or right beside them, and scientific communities racing to improve early warning and building codes faster than the clock is ticking on the next major rupture. Back here at home, the response to all of this hasn't been nothing, to be fair. The National Science Foundation handed the University of Washington a $15 million grant specifically to bolster earthquake preparedness research and monitoring infrastructure in the region. funding that's gone toward exactly the kind of deep-sea sensor networks and sediment analysis that produced these recent discoveries. States up and down the coast have also been steadily investing in the Shake Alert early warning system, a network of sensors that can't predict when an earthquake will happen. Nobody can do that yet, but can detect the very first seismic waves the instant a quake begins and push out a warning to cell phones, potentially seconds before the more destructive shaking arrives. Seconds sound small, but in earthquake terms, even 10 or 15 seconds of warning is enough time for a surgeon to stop an operation, for a train to slow down, for a kid to get under a desk instead of near a window. Oregon, Washington, and California have all been steadily building out this system, layering more sensors onto the seafloor and along the coastline every year, specifically because of how blind we've historically been to Cascadia's actual behavior. Now let's connect the dots here, because here's the analysis that I think a lot of coverage on this topic misses. For years, the public conversation around West Coast earthquake risk has basically boiled down to one number, the odds of the big one happening on Cascadia alone. That's the number everyone quotes. That's the number that shows up in the documentaries and the disaster movies. One giant fault, one giant quake, one giant tsunami. But what the last few years of research are actually telling us is that the real risk picture is a lot messier and honestly a lot more interesting than a single fault with a single probability attached to it. You've got fluid actively migrating through the fault system in ways that appear to directly influence how strain builds and releases across different segments. You've got growing evidence that Cascadia isn't operating in isolation at all, that it may be mechanically linked to the San Andreas Fault hundreds of miles to the south in ways that could turn a single fault disaster into a coordinated multi-city catastrophe. And you've got a constant background hum of activity on nearby systems like the Blanco Fracture Zone that, while not dangerous on their own, keep drawing attention back to the main event every single time they rattle. Put those threads together and what you get isn't really a story about whether the big one will happen. Geologically speaking, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. What you get instead is a much more complicated question about how many disasters could unfold at once, how fast they could cascade from one region into the next, and whether the infrastructure, evacuation planning, and emergency response systems built for a single fault scenario are actually adequate for a synchronized multi-fault event that emergency planners are only now starting to seriously model. And here's the honesty check nobody really wants to sit with. A lot of the built environment along the Pacific Northwest coast, older brick buildings and downtown cores, unreinforced masonry schools, bridges built decades before modern seismic codes existed, simply wasn't designed with a scenario like this in mind. Retrofitting an entire region's infrastructure costs billions of dollars and takes decades, and it's the kind of slow, unglamorous, expensive work that's easy for budgets and headlines to deprioritize right up until the moment it's too late to matter. Meanwhile, the fault itself doesn't care about budget cycles or election timelines. It's been quietly locking and loading stress for 326 years now, patient in a way that nothing built by humans really has to be. So here's what I want to leave you with. The science coming out of places like the University of Washington and Oregon State isn't meant to scare you into doom scrolling. It's meant to sharpen exactly what we're preparing for. Understanding that fluid pathways influence fault behavior, understanding that two of the deadliest fault systems on the continent might be capable of triggering each other. That's not fear-mongering. That's the kind of detailed picture that actually helps emergency planners build better warning systems, better evacuation routes, and better building codes. The 15% chance over the next 50 years might sound low if you're only half paying attention, but flip that around and ask yourself if you'd get on a plane that had a 1 in 7 chance of a serious mechanical failure. Suddenly, that number feels a whole lot different. So what do you guys think? Do you think this new research showing Cascadia and San Andreas might be linked changes how seriously people should be taking this? Do you live anywhere near the West Coast, and if so, do you actually have an earthquake kit ready to go? I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts and experiences down in the comments below. If this kind of deep dive into what's happening beneath our feet is something you're into, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Drop a like if you found this useful, and share it with anybody you know living along that coastline. Because the more people understand what's actually happening down there, the better prepared this entire region is going to be when the ground finally decides to move. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.